The phone buzzed against the polished oak desk, a sound too ordinary for what it carried. Natalie Pierce looked up from a spreadsheet full of numbers that suddenly meant nothing. On the screen, her daughter's name flashed: Emma, age 13. It was the middle of a school day. Her stomach tightened before she even answered. "Mom." Emma's voice trembled, almost swallowed by the crackle of static. "Grandma and Grandpa are here. They're moving our stuff into the garage." Natalie froze. The tip of her pen snapped. "What?" she whispered. On the other end, she heard her 10-year-old son Liam crying in the background. Then Eleanor's sharp voice cut through, crisp and cold. "Stop whining, children. Be grateful you still have a roof over your heads." Emma sniffled, her breath hitching. "They said our rooms are too big for kids. They're turning them into offices for their company. They're throwing everything into boxes." Natalie's mind went blank for one heartbeat and then filled with pure, steady heat. Eleanor and Howard Pierce, her in-laws, had finally crossed the line. 3 months ago, they'd shown up on her doorstep claiming they were facing temporary financial struggles with Pierce & Co. Realty. Daniel, her husband, had insisted they take them in. "Just until they get back on their feet," he'd said, smiling that nervous, dutiful son smile. Natalie had agreed because that was what family was supposed to do, help. But now, standing in her quiet office, she realized that help had turned into invasion. She rose, already reaching for her car keys. "Emma, listen to me carefully," she said, her tone firm but calm. "Don't argue. Don't touch anything. Just watch and remember everything they say." Her daughter's small voice wavered. "Are you mad at me?" "No, sweetheart," Natalie said softly, eyes narrowing with resolve. "I'm mad at them." She hung up, gathered her bag, and walked through the glass doors of her firm. The receptionist opened her mouth to ask something, but Natalie was already gone, her heels clicking like gunfire on the marble floor. Outside, the October sun glared off her car windshield, too bright, too sharp. She drove in silence, each red light pounding against her patience. She could almost see it: Eleanor rearranging her daughter's shelves, Howard barking orders at the movers as if he owned the place. By the time Natalie turned onto her tree-lined street, her heart was no longer racing. It was steady, dangerous, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. She saw the boxes before she even parked. Stacks of them on the driveway, labels scrawled in black marker: Emma's books, Liam's toys. Beside them, her daughter sat on the steps, knees pulled to her chest, eyes red. "Mom." Emma breathed relief, flooding her face. "They threw out my posters. Grandpa said they looked childish." Natalie crouched down, brushing a tear from her cheek. "It's okay, honey. Go wait in Aunt Rachel's car, all right? She's coming to get you." Across the lawn, the front door opened, and Eleanor appeared wearing her pearl earrings and that same smug composure she reserved for charity luncheons. "Oh, good you're home," she said brightly, as if nothing were wrong. "We're making a few necessary adjustments." Inside, the chaos was surgical. Movers hauled desks, boxes, and lamps down the hallway. Howard stood in what used to be Liam's room, setting up his laptop on the boy's small desk. The walls were bare posters, stripped shelves emptied. "The garage is fine for them," Howard said without looking up. "Kids adapt. We need the space for our business affairs." Natalie's voice came out low-measured. "Business affairs?" "Exactly," Eleanor chimed in. "We have clients to impress. Presentation is everything in real estate." A book toppled from a box beside her, Emma's copy of Charlotte's Web. Natalie bent, picked it up, and turned it over slowly in her hand. The spine was cracked, the corners bent. Something in her chest clicked into place. She looked at them, really looked: two people so used to taking that they no longer saw the harm they caused. "Where are the kids supposed to do their homework?" she asked. "The garage doesn't even have a table." Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "They'll manage. When we were young, we didn't have all these luxuries. It will build character." Natalie smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're right," she said softly. "This will build something." She turned, walked into the kitchen, and took a slow, steady breath. Her pulse had returned to normal, her thoughts lining up with cold precision. The moment she picked up her phone, her reflection stared back from the black screen, composed, unshakable. "Rachel," she said when the call connected. "It's time." The smell of lemon cleaner always brought Natalie back to that first dinner at the Pierce house 10 years ago when she still believed she could earn Eleanor's respect. The dining room gleamed like a museum's silver-polished crystal glasses lined up perfectly. Natalie had spent the entire afternoon helping Eleanor prepare chopping vegetables while her future mother-in-law barked orders. "You're not doing it right," Eleanor snapped, grabbing the knife from her hand. "Daniel likes them thinner." She'd smiled through it back then, thinking it was just nerves that maybe someday Eleanor would soften, but that softness never came. At the wedding, Eleanor gave a speech that made everyone laugh except Natalie. "Our Daniel always chooses wisely," she'd said, smiling at the crowd. "He picked someone practical, not the prettiest girl in the room, but the most stable." The guests chuckled politely. Natalie had stood beside her new husband, holding her bouquet so tightly her fingers ached, pretending the words didn't sting. After that came the years of quiet erosion. Every visit turned into a test of patience. Eleanor would stroll through their home, inspecting like an auditor. Still renting, she'd ask, "You really should have invested earlier. Daniel's parents could have guided you if you'd asked." Howard always followed with his gruff chuckle. "You accountants think you know money," he'd say, "but real wealth comes from risk." They'd never seen her 2 a.m. Nights balancing client books never cared that she was the one paying off Daniel's student loans while his parents bragged about funding his future. When Emma was born, Eleanor showed up with her own list of appropriate baby names. She crossed her arms when Natalie said she'd already chosen one. "Emma sounds plain. Try something elegant." "Eleonora has history." Daniel, as always, stayed silent. And then came the insults disguised as advice. "You really should fix your posture, dear," Eleanor would say. "It makes you look insecure." Or Howard's favorite, "If you made more money, Daniel wouldn't have to work so hard." They dismissed her promotions as luck, ignored her small wins, and acted like every success belonged to their son. When Natalie finally started her own consulting firm, Eleanor sent flowers with a note that read, "We're proud you found a hobby." Through it all, Natalie smiled, learned, adapted. She studied people the way she studied numbers, quietly, carefully. She saw how Howard's arrogance hid fear of failure, how Eleanor's cruelty was armor for insecurity. They called it family. She called it survival. The turning point came 2 years earlier at Christmas. Eleanor arrived late wearing diamonds, carrying no gifts. Natalie had spent days cooking. At dinner, Eleanor looked around and said, "We should have hosted this at our house. This place feels small." Howard laughed. Daniel forced a smile. Emma and Liam stared at their plates. Natalie had felt something inside her flicker out. That night, when everyone slept, she sat by the fireplace with a glass of wine and realized she'd been trying to earn approval from people who only respected control. She decided then she would never beg for belonging again. So when the phone rang earlier today, when Emma's voice trembled and Liam cried, that decision became action. This wasn't just about rooms, it was about reclaiming every inch of dignity she'd surrendered. The pattern was clear. Eleanor and Howard took whatever they could because Daniel's silence allowed it. His loyalty was love in his eyes, but to them, it was permission. Natalie had spent years believing that patience was grace. Now she understood it was ammunition. Every late-night balance sheet, every client meeting, every risk she'd taken, they were her quiet rebellion. She remembered Howard's smirk the day she told him she'd started investing. "You'll lose it all," he'd said. "Leave business to people who can stomach it." But she hadn't lost. She'd built. Slowly. Secretly. And tonight, as she stood in her kitchen surrounded by boxes of her children's displaced lives, she realized the irony was perfect. They were taking over rooms to run a company she now quietly owned. For years, they'd treated her like a servant. Tomorrow, they'd learn who was really serving whom. When Natalie pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon sun hit her windshield like fire, and she could already see the chaos through the open garage door. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, labels scrawled in Eleanor's neat handwriting, toys, old clothes, miscellaneous. But mixed in were things that weren't old at all. Emma's piano books, Liam's baseball gear, their art projects from school. A framed photo of both kids at the Grand Canyon lay cracked against a stack of dusty boxes. The smell of dust and cardboard burned her throat. Her daughter sat on the front steps, knees pulled to her chest, eyes swollen from crying. They said we should be grateful, Emma whispered, voice small. Grandma told me a big house isn't for children who don't appreciate it. Natalie brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, forcing her own voice to stay even. You didn't do anything wrong, honey. Go wait with Aunt Rachel, okay? She's almost here. Emma hesitated. Will they be mad? Natalie smiled faintly. They already are, but they won't be for long. Inside, it looked like a moving company had declared war. Two men in Pierce Realty polos carried Liam's desk into the garage, stepping over piles of books. Eleanor stood in the hallway like a queen, inspecting her kingdom clipboard in hand, issuing orders. Put the file cabinet in the bigger room. We'll need more space for client meetings. Natalie froze when she heard Liam's small, furious voice from the top of the stairs. That's my desk, he shouted. Howard turned expression-flat voice dismissive. No, son, it's my desk now. You'll understand when you're older. We need it for important business. The boy's fists balled at his sides. You can't just take it, Howard, Eleanor said, tone clipped. Let the child vent. He'll learn humility. Natalie stepped forward, every word sharp and deliberate. What's going on here? Eleanor's face lit up with false cheer. Oh, good, you're home. We're making a few adjustments, long overdue ones, if you ask me. The children's rooms are far too big for their needs. We need proper workspaces to rebuild the company. It's for everyone's benefit. Natalie scanned the hallway. Her children's posters had been stripped from the walls, their clothes dumped in trash bags. The air smelled like sweat and arrogance. You're turning their bedrooms into offices, she asked, her voice deceptively calm. We're repurposing space, Eleanor corrected. You of all people should understand efficiency, dear. After all, you work with numbers. Howard appeared beside her laptop, already tucked under his arm. Kids adapt. When we were young, we didn't even have private rooms. We turned out fine. Natalie's jaw tightened. Fine, she repeated softly. You think this is fine? He waved a hand. You're overreacting. Family sacrifices together. This company fed you for years. It's time to give back. Her laugh came out low, humorless. Fed me? Eleanor straightened, offended. Don't start that tone with us, Natalie. You live in this house because of Daniel. Without him, without us. Where would you even be? Natalie took a step closer until the air itself seemed to still. You're right, Eleanor, she said evenly. Where would I be without you? The question hung heavy between them, unanswered but dangerous. Then she turned to Liam, still trembling near the stairs. Sweetheart, go help your sister pack what's left in the garage. Aunt Rachel's on her way. When they were gone, she faced her in-laws again. You've made your point. You think you own this family. Eleanor's smile didn't falter. We don't think we do. Daniel understands loyalty. He knows what family means. Natalie's lips curved into a controlled, icy smile. We'll see how loyal he feels when he gets home. As she walked into the kitchen, she caught her reflection in the glass door eyes, cold hands steady. The woman staring back wasn't the one who used to flinch at every jab. That woman was gone. She poured herself a glass of water, drank it slowly, then opened her laptop. The whir of the booting screen was the only sound in the house. Behind her, Eleanor's voice carried down the hallway, still issuing commands as if she owned the world. Natalie typed one word into her private email folder, acquisition. Then she whispered to herself, let's see how they handle a real takeover. That night, the house felt wrong. The air was thick with silence, the kind that hides anger just beneath it. Eleanor had taken over the dining room, spreading company files across the table, while Howard paced the hallway, barking into his phone. They acted like hosts, not guests. Natalie moved quietly through her own home, her bare feet soundless on the hardwood floor. Daniel sat on the couch, shoulders hunched, eyes tired. They're just trying to get back on their feet, he said, the same words he'd repeated for months. It's temporary. Natalie didn't answer. She opened the refrigerator, poured herself a glass of wine, and stared out the window. The moonlight glinted off the boxes stacked in the garage. Temporary, she murmured, isn't supposed to destroy the people it borrows from. Upstairs, she passed her children's empty rooms, beds stripped, shelves bare. In one corner, a single crayon drawing had been left behind, Emma's family portrait. 4 stick figures stood under a crooked sun, smiling. Natalie traced her finger over the paper. Not tonight, she thought. Not ever again. She went downstairs to the study, locked the door, and opened her laptop. On the screen glowed a folder labeled Pierce & Co. Internal. Over the past 6 months, while pretending to be the obedient daughter-in-law, she'd been building her own defense. It started as curiosity. Howard's real estate company had been faltering, and Natalie, a financial consultant, couldn't resist checking public filings. What she'd found was a mess: loans, unpaid client refunds, delayed private spending hidden under corporate development. The deeper she dug, the uglier it got. Eleanor had transferred company funds to personal accounts, listing them as retreat expenses. Howard had mortgaged one of their properties without board approval. Natalie had spent nights gathering evidence, investing through holding companies, and quietly acquiring shares whenever panic selling began. Piece by piece, she'd built control until she owned 53% of the firm. Now she drafted an email to Rachel, her lawyer and oldest friend. The subject line was simple: activation. Rachel replied within minutes. "You're sure?" "Once this starts, there's no going back." Natalie typed back. "They took my kids' rooms today." She hit send. Then she opened a new message, this one to the board of directors of Pierce & Co. Realty. Her fingers flew across the keys with a calm precision that came only from righteous anger. To the board, she wrote, "Attached are photos and documentation that raise concerns regarding current leadership's judgment and conduct. I urge an immediate review of operations. A family that treats its own this way cannot be trusted with clients' assets." She attached everything: photos of the garage full of toys, screenshots of financial mismanagement records of her own share acquisitions. Then she pressed send. When she closed the laptop, she felt no thrill, only stillness. The kind that comes when justice starts breathing. At 11:00 p.m., Eleanor entered the kitchen, hair perfectly set, as if she hadn't spent the day dismantling her grandchildren's lives. "The kitchen is communal," she said coolly. "We'll need it for client meetings tomorrow." Natalie didn't even look up from her glass. "Tomorrow afternoon won't work for me," she said evenly. Howard appeared behind her, adjusting his cufflinks. "Your schedule," he scoffed. "This isn't about you, Natalie. A little sacrifice from everyone is necessary." Her voice dropped calm, but razor sharp. "You mean the kind of sacrifice that involves throwing your grandchildren's things into the garage?" Howard's jaw clenched. "Now see here." "No," she interrupted, her tone ice. "You see here. This is my house. My name is on the deed. You are guests who've overstayed and insulted my family." Eleanor crossed her arms, her voice rising. "We're family. Family helps each other. You, of all people, should understand that." Natalie smiled faintly. "You're right, Eleanor. Family helps each other. Remember that tomorrow." She rose her chair, scraping the tile. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a long day ahead." Howard frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Natalie paused at the doorway, turning just enough for the moonlight to catch her eyes. "It means," she said softly, "by this time tomorrow, you'll finally understand who you've been living with." The next evening, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic drifted through the house, though no one seemed to notice. Natalie had cooked, as she always did, quietly and without comment. Daniel sat at the head of the table, trying to make conversation about work, about anything that would drown out the tension pressing in from every wall. Eleanor and Howard were in high spirits, laughing too loudly, drinking too much wine, pretending the previous day hadn't happened. They spoke about their upcoming big meeting with the board, a chance, as Howard said, to prove that experience always wins over panic. Natalie poured herself a small glass of wine and listened, her smile faint, her eyes unreadable. "Tomorrow decides everything," Eleanor said, slicing into her chicken. "We'll show the board we're still in control." She turned to Natalie with that familiar saccharine grin. "Daniel told me you've been keeping up with the finances here at home. At least you're putting that little accounting hobby to use." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom." "It's fine," Natalie said softly, placing her fork down. "Actually, Eleanor, I'm glad you brought up tomorrow's meeting." The table quieted. "You'll be there?" Howard asked, half laughing. "No offense, dear, but these meetings aren't for family spectators." Natalie looked him squarely in the eye. "Oh, I'll be there. I'll be leading it." The laughter that followed was loud and brittle. Eleanor nearly choked on her wine. "You..." she said, wiping her mouth with her napkin. Leading Pierce & Co. Realty. That's adorable. Howard leaned back smirking. I think you've had one too many glasses, Natalie. You don't even work for the company. Natalie's voice stayed calm, almost kind. You're right. I don't work for the company. She paused long enough for the silence to thicken. I own it. Daniel blinked, confused. What are you talking about? Howard chuckled, but the sound faltered when Natalie reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She laid it flat on the table between the plates. This, she said evenly, is documentation of my ownership. 53% of Pierce & Co. Realty acquired legally through subsidiary holdings over the past 6 months. Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. That's impossible. You wouldn't even know how to buy shares. Natalie's smile was polite. You'd be surprised what your accounting hobby can do when it pays attention. Daniel stared at the paper, his face pale. Natalie, is this real? Yes, she said quietly. Every document, every transaction, every mistake they made is real. Howard slammed his palm on the table, rattling the silverware. You manipulated us. I played by the rules. You ignored, she replied. And tomorrow the board will see exactly what kind of leadership you've been providing. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice trembling with outrage. You would humiliate your own family. Family, Natalie said, her tone suddenly hard. You threw my children's things into a garage like trash. You humiliated yourself. The clock ticked. No one spoke. Even Daniel couldn't find words. He looked between his parents and his wife, realizing perhaps for the first time which of them had truly been protecting the family. Natalie folded the document neatly and placed it back into her folder. Dinner was lovely, she said, her voice smooth as glass. But I have work to do. Eleanor's voice cracked behind her. You'll regret this, Natalie. You don't understand what you're doing. Natalie turned at the doorway. I understand perfectly. You spent years teaching me exactly how you operate. You treat people like property. You think kindness is weakness. She smiled, a calm, terrible smile. Tomorrow I'll show you what strength looks like. When she left the dining room, the tension exploded behind her. Howard's voice booming, Eleanor crying angry tears, Daniel trying to calm them both. But Natalie didn't look back. She went to her study, placed her laptop in her bag, and stared at her reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back wasn't scared. She was finished pretending. In 12 hours, the Pierce empire would face its reckoning, and she would be the one holding the gavel. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Natalie sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the floor like a pale confession. She remembered another night years ago when the world had felt just as heavy. Back then, she'd been sitting on a park bench outside her old office, a cardboard box at her feet, the word, terminated, still echoing in her mind. Her company had downsized during a market crash, and she was one of the names cut loose. Howard had called that same evening not to comfort her, but to gloat. That's the thing about you number crunchers, he'd said with that smug chuckle. You think you understand business because you can balance a checkbook, but real success requires instinct, not caution. She'd thanked him politely, hung up, and then sat there under the flickering streetlight, shivering. Her savings were dwindling. Daniel's parents had made it clear they thought she'd failed him, and Eleanor had told her over lunch the next day, maybe this is your chance to focus on being a proper wife. Natalie hadn't argued. She'd smiled, nodded, and then quietly started over. She took online courses, studied market behavior late into the night, and built her first client base from the ground up. For years, she worked in silence, saving, investing, learning. She watched people like Howard, loud, reckless, convinced their charm could replace integrity, and she realized that survival wasn't about power. It was about precision. It was about waiting for the exact moment when the numbers turned in your favor. That realization had changed her life. She'd turned her tiny home office into a consultancy that grew one client at a time until it supported her family. Howard never acknowledged it, of course. At every holiday dinner, he'd still lecture about the art of risk. When she tried to explain her methods, he'd wave a hand. That's cute, Natalie, but it's not real business. The last time he'd said it, she'd been reviewing Pierce & Co. Realty's quarterly filings, public information she'd stumbled upon by accident. What she saw had stopped her cold, negative cash flow asset depreciation internal transfers that looked suspicious. They were circling the drain, and Howard didn't even know it. That was when the idea had sparked quiet, clean, inevitable. She began buying small portions of their stock through a trust in her maiden name. Nobody noticed. She wasn't important enough to track. When Eleanor bragged about their growing empire, Natalie was at home studying the company's debt structure. When Howard laughed about knowing how to make money, she was quietly acquiring the foundation under his feet. Now, sitting in the dark, she realized how poetic it all was. They had mocked her for being cautious, but caution had built the trap they'd walked into. Down the hall, she heard Daniel's soft breathing, the rhythm of someone exhausted from living between loyalties. She knew he didn't understand what she was doing, not yet. But tomorrow he would. He would see that love wasn't compliance. It was protection, and sometimes protection required sharp edges. She looked at the framed photo of her children on the nightstand, Emma holding Liam's hand, both smiling in front of their school. They were why she endured, why she fought. Every insult, every condescending smile from Eleanor had been another line in the blueprint of this moment. Outside, the first faint light of dawn crept over the horizon. Natalie stood, brushed invisible dust from her sleeves, and walked to the mirror. Her reflection was pale but steady. She looked like her mother, strong jaw, quiet eyes, the woman who had once told her, "Let them underestimate you. It's the only advantage you'll ever need." Natalie smiled faintly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel underestimated. She felt ready. By the time the sun fully rose, she was already dressed in a charcoal suit, her hair tied back neatly, the calm mask of a woman about to reclaim not just her home, but her name. The next morning, Natalie arrived 15 minutes early to the Pierce & Co. Realty headquarters. The building was all glass and arrogance, just like the people who ran it. She stepped through the revolving doors, the click of her heels echoing across the marble lobby. Receptionists glanced up, offering polite smiles that turned curious when they saw the confidence in her stride. She didn't wait to be announced. She didn't need to. Upstairs in the boardroom, the long mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The chairs were already filled with shareholders, executives, and the company's legal counsel. Charles Montgomery, the board chairman, stood as she entered. "Mrs. Pierce," he greeted, his voice calm but knowing. "We've been expecting you." She returned his nod. "Thank you, Charles. Has the board reviewed the files I sent?" "They have," he said, "and they're eager to hear more." Natalie took her seat at the head of the table, Howard's usual place. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A few executives exchanged nervous glances. Through the glass wall, the city stretched below them, the skyline sharp against the pale morning sky. The tension hummed like static. A knock on the door cut through the silence. It opened sharply, and Howard and Eleanor swept in, faces flushed, voices high. "What is the meaning of this?" Howard demanded, his briefcase swinging at his side. "An emergency board meeting." "We weren't informed until this morning." Charles gestured toward the empty chairs. "Please sit." Howard scowled. "Not until someone tells me what's going on." Then he noticed Natalie at the head of the table. His mouth twitched, confusion flickering into disdain. "What is she doing here?" Charles adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Pierce isn't just your daughter-in-law, Mr. Pierce. As of last quarter, she's our majority shareholder." Eleanor's gasp was small but sharp, like glass breaking. "That's impossible," she whispered. "She's lying." Natalie slid a folder across the table. Inside was a neatly organized collection of documents, ownership records, bank transfers, acquisition filings, each stamped and verified. "You've been selling shares to cover your losses for months," she said evenly. "You never noticed who was buying them." Howard grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages, his hands trembling. This can't be legal." "Oh, it's perfectly legal," Charles replied, his voice neutral but firm. "Every transaction was made in accordance with company law. Mrs. Pierce simply saw value where you saw decline." Eleanor's face had gone pale. "You can't just waltz in here and take everything we built." Natalie folded her hands. "You're mistaken. I didn't take what you built. I rescued what you were destroying." She pressed a button on the laptop in front of her, connecting to the boardroom's large display screen. A slideshow appeared photos of Emma and Liam's belongings scattered across the garage floor boxes labeled junk. Then came the spreadsheet's misused funds, duplicate invoices, personal charges buried under client entertainment. Each image hung in the air like evidence in a courtroom. This, she said, her voice steady, is not only unethical, it's dangerous. If this is how you treat your own grandchildren's space, how do you treat your client's assets? Howard's face darkened. You're mixing business with family matters, he snapped. No, Charles interjected smoothly. She's demonstrating a pattern of judgment, and poor judgment at home often translates to poor judgment in leadership. The board murmured in agreement. Howard's confidence cracked. You can't fire us. The company is ours. Charles turned to Natalie. Mrs. Pierce, would you like to make your recommendation? Natalie met Howard's furious gaze. Effective immediately, she said clearly. I move to remove Howard and Eleanor Pierce from all executive and managerial duties within Pierce & Co. Realty pending full financial audit. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Then, Charles nodded. All in favor. Hands rose one by one until the majority stood with her. Howard slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing through the boardroom. You'll regret this, he growled. You're destroying your own family. Natalie stood collecting her papers with unhurried grace. You destroyed this family the moment you decided power was more important than respect. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the kind that came from remorse. They were the bitter kind, the tears of a woman watching her empire crumble. Where will we go? She whispered. What are we supposed to do now? Natalie paused at the door, turning slightly. The garage is perfectly fine, she said softly. You're older. You'll adjust. Howard lunged halfway out of his chair, his voice breaking. You think this makes you better than us? You think Daniel will stand for this? She looked at him, then calm and unmoved. Daniel already knows, she said. He's the one who told me to move up the timeline. The words landed like a blow. Eleanor's expression fractured disbelief, splintering into horror. He sided with you. He sided with what's right, Natalie said simply. Charles cleared his throat. This meeting is adjourned. Natalie gathered her folder, gave a curt nod to the board, and walked out. The doors closed behind her, muting the sound of Howard's protests. In the corridor, the sunlight poured through the tall windows sharp and clean. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Justice wasn't loud, it was precise. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A message from Rachel Board verdict. Natalie typed back. Unanimous. They're out. Then she slipped the phone into her pocket and exhaled slowly. The city below glimmered like glass shards catching light. For the first time in years, she felt the weight lift. The empire that once crushed her was hers, now not for revenge, but for order. For peace. By the time Natalie pulled into the driveway that afternoon, the Pierce estate was already buzzing with consequence. Eleanor and Howard's phones hadn't stopped ringing since the board meeting ended first their lawyer, then the press, then a handful of clients who had somehow gotten wind of the leadership restructuring. The news had traveled faster than Natalie expected. She could hear Eleanor's voice from the living room before she even stepped inside, sharp and trembling with fury. You have humiliated us. Do you understand what you've done? You've ruined the Pierce name. Natalie set her bag down and met her mother-in-law's glare. No, Eleanor, you ruined it when you started treating your family like collateral. Howard appeared from the hallway, his face red. You think this is over? You don't get to erase 40 years of work. I didn't erase it, Natalie said evenly. I just turned the lights back on so everyone could see the mess. Daniel stepped between them, his expression hollow. Mom, Dad, please stop. He turned to Natalie, his voice softer. I heard what happened. The board called me. His eyes were searching, almost pleading. You really did it. I had to, she said quietly. They left me no choice. He looked down, and for a moment she feared he would side with them again, that he would ask her to undo everything just to keep the peace. But instead, he exhaled slowly, then looked up with something new in his eyes, resolve. You should have done it sooner, he said. Eleanor's mouth fell open. Daniel, you can't possibly. I can. He interrupted, his voice firm for once. I should have stood up to you years ago. You treated Natalie like she was disposable, and I let you." Howard shook his head in disbelief. "You're siding with her after everything we did for you." "What you did for me," Daniel said bitterly, "was make me believe that family meant obedience." "It doesn't. It means respect." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, Eleanor's confidence faltered. "Where are we supposed to go?" she whispered. "This is our home, too." Natalie crossed her arms. "No, it's mine. You've had 72 hours to find somewhere else." Howard's laugh was hollow, bitter. "You can't throw us out." "I can," she said, and her voice was calm, final. "And I already did. The eviction notice went out this morning." Eleanor's hands trembled. "You're cruel," she hissed. "We raised that man. We built the foundation you're standing on." Natalie stepped closer, her tone soft but lethal. "And I built the roof that's been keeping you dry." She turned to leave, but Howard's voice followed her. "You'll regret this. When you have nothing left, no husband, no family, you'll remember what loyalty meant." She paused in the doorway, looking back at them both. "Loyalty isn't slavery, Howard. It's earned, not inherited." Then she walked away. Upstairs, Daniel sat on the edge of their bed, head in his hands. "I never thought it would come to this," he murmured. "Neither did I," Natalie admitted, sitting beside him, "but maybe it had to." He nodded, staring at the floor. "You didn't just save the company. You saved our kids from growing up thinking this is normal." Downstairs, drawers slammed, voices rose, the sound of people packing under protest. Eleanor's sobs carried faintly through the halls, mingling with Howard's curses. Natalie didn't flinch. She went to Emma's room, her real room, and began unpacking boxes, smoothing sheets, restoring the small universe her children had been forced out of. When Emma and Liam returned that evening, their joy was wordless. They ran through the hallway, laughing, reclaiming their corners of the house. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching them. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Even if it hurts." Natalie met his gaze, her voice steady. "Doing the right thing always hurts at first." The next morning, when the moving truck pulled away, carrying Eleanor and Howard's luggage, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was freedom. For the first time in months, the house felt like a home again. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. The air didn't smell like Eleanor's overpowering perfume or Howard's cigar smoke. It smelled like cinnamon from the muffins Emma was baking with Daniel downstairs. Natalie stood at the top of the stairs, listening to the sound of her children's laughter echo through the hallway that had once carried nothing but criticism. She looked around at the rooms, now theirs again. Liam's baseball posters were back on the wall, his glove on the shelf where it belonged. Emma's piano sat in the corner of her room, sunlight glinting off the keys. It was as if the walls themselves had exhaled. She sat on the edge of Emma's bed, helping her fold blankets. "Does it feel better?" she asked. Emma smiled shyly. "It feels like it's ours again." She hesitated. "Mom, were Grandma and Grandpa always mean?" Natalie considered the question. "Not always," she said softly. "But they forgot that love isn't supposed to hurt. When people think control is love, they end up breaking the very thing they're trying to keep." Emma frowned, thinking it over. "Do you still love them?" Natalie smiled faintly. "I'll always wish they'd been kinder, but love doesn't mean letting someone walk all over you. Sometimes the best way to love someone is to stop them before they do more harm." Downstairs, Daniel was repainting the living room. The color was lighter now, a soft cream replacing the cold gray Eleanor had chosen when she first moved in. Natalie joined him, rolling a fresh coat across the wall. "Looks like we're rebuilding," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, eyes thoughtful. "I keep thinking about what my father said, that loyalty means standing by your family no matter what." Natalie dipped her roller into the paint tray. "Loyalty without respect isn't love. It's fear, and we've been afraid for too long." He stopped painting, looking at her. "You're right. You didn't just fight them, you taught us what boundaries actually mean." She smiled gently. "Family isn't about control, Daniel. It's about protection. That's what we're teaching Emma and Liam now." By sunset, the walls gleamed in their new color. The light poured in warm and forgiving. Natalie took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself to earn approval to keep the peace that she'd almost forgotten what peace felt like. Now it wasn't something she had to chase. It lived here in the laughter of her children and the quiet certainty in Daniel's voice when he said, "I'm proud of you." That night, after the kids were asleep, Natalie walked through the house alone. She stopped by the study, her study now, and ran her hand along the polished desk. This was the same space where Eleanor had once declared the kitchen communal. The memory almost made her smile. She glanced out the window. The sky was deep blue, the moon suspended above the dark rooftops. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small beneath it. When she returned to her bedroom, Daniel was waiting. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than okay. For the first time, I feel like this is truly our life, not borrowed, not shared out of guilt, just ours." He reached for her hand. "You built all of this, Natalie, every bit of it." She shook her head softly. "No, we built it. Together. The difference is now we know how to protect it." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the last remnants of the past. Upstairs, Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like laughter, and Natalie, standing in the doorway, smiled through the dark. The home was whole again, strong, quiet, and free. News travels fast in business circles, especially when it involves a family collapse. Within days of the board's decision, Pierce & Co. Realty became the headline of every local business paper. Pierce Realty scandal leadership, ousted amid mismanagement claims. The photo that accompanied the article showed Howard walking out of the company building, face hidden behind a newspaper, Eleanor trailing behind him, sunglasses failing to hide her humiliation. Natalie didn't enjoy the coverage. She didn't need to. The truth was its own statement. At the newly renamed Summit Realty Group, Natalie attended a follow-up meeting with Charles Montgomery and the board. The logo outside the building had already changed. The brass letters that once read Pierce & Co. were gone, replaced by something clean, modern, forward-facing. Charles smiled as she entered. "You've done this company a favor," he said. "We were sinking under their ego. You've given us a chance to rebuild." Natalie nodded. "Then make sure this time it's built on integrity." He extended a folder across the table. Inside were the official papers confirming Howard and Eleanor's permanent removal, their assets frozen pending audit. Natalie signed quietly. The pen felt heavy but right. Meanwhile, back at the Pierce residence, her residence, the fallout had turned Eleanor brittle. She called twice, then 10 times, each voicemail angrier than the last. "You think this is justice?" One message spat. "You're teaching your children cruelty." Another came hours later, the voice cracked and tired. "We made mistakes, but you've destroyed everything." Natalie didn't respond. She didn't even delete them. She let them sit there, relics of a world she no longer belonged to. A week later, she received an envelope through certified mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Howard's formal request for an appeal to the board demanding reinstatement. Attached was a handwritten note. "You've made your point. Now step aside before you embarrass yourself further." Natalie folded it neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and wrote one word across the front in bold black ink: "Denied." By the second week, the full audit results came in. Millions misallocated invoices forged even minor tax evasion buried in the records. Howard and Eleanor's reputations collapsed overnight. Their names were removed from the Real Estate Association's registry, their business licenses suspended. Investors they'd bragged about for years pulled out entirely. Natalie didn't need revenge. Consequences had taken care of it for her. Daniel saw it all happen quietly from the sidelines. "They called me," he said one night over dinner. "They want us to forgive them. They said they'll sign over what's left if you'll drop the audit." Natalie looked up from her plate, calm but resolute. "Forgiveness isn't a transaction. They don't understand that yet." Daniel nodded slowly. "They're living in a motel outside town. Mom said the neighbors won't even speak to them." Natalie took a breath, feeling neither triumph nor pity. "That's not my doing. That's the echo of their own choices." The next morning, she drove past the company building, now Summit Realty Group, and stopped at the curb. Workers were removing the last of the old signage. The letters Pierce lay scattered on the ground, tarnished and bent. She stepped out, picked up the letter E, and turned it in her hand. The metal was cold, its edges sharp. For a moment, she thought about Eleanor's voice, once so commanding, now silenced by reality. She set the letter down gently. "Legacy," she murmured, "isn't what you leave behind. It's what survives after truth touches it." That afternoon, an internal memo from Charles circulated to all employees, effective immediately. Summit Realty Group is under new leadership committed to transparency, family ethics, and client trust. Natalie read it and smiled faintly. Justice didn't always come in dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrived quietly in new signs, new air, and the sound of hammers building something honest where deceit once stood. At home that evening, Emma asked Mom, "Are Grandma and Grandpa ever coming back?" Natalie shook her head. "No, sweetheart, not here." Liam frowned. "Because they were bad, because they chose power over love," she said gently. "And that's the one mistake that always costs everything." The following months unfolded like a long exhale. The tension that had once lived inside the house was gone, replaced by a rhythm. Natalie had almost forgotten. Laughter over breakfast piano notes floating through the air, her children's footsteps echoing across the hallway. There was peace, but also something deeper space. Space for forgiveness that wasn't rushed. Space for silence that wasn't heavy. Summit Realty Group thrived under its new management. Charles handled daily operations while Natalie remained a silent majority shareholder, stepping in only when ethics or direction needed her voice. Quarterly reports came back stronger than ever, clean books satisfied clients, staff bonuses reinstated. For the first time in years, the company's growth wasn't built on image, but integrity. She read each report not as victory, but as proof that rebuilding was possible when power served purpose. At home, life settled into something that resembled grace. One Saturday morning, while Liam worked on his science project at the kitchen table, he asked Mom, "Did Grandpa really lose everything?" Natalie stirred her coffee before answering. "He lost what he valued most," she said softly. "Control. But sometimes losing control is what teaches people who they really are." Liam nodded, thoughtful beyond his years. "So, did we win?" She smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart. We just stopped losing." Emma joined them, then setting down a plate of muffins. "Dad said Grandma called again," she murmured. He didn't answer. Natalie's hand froze briefly around her mug. "That's his choice," she said evenly. "Some lessons take longer to learn." She had no bitterness left, only distance, the kind that came after finally closing a wound that had been reopened too many times. Later that week, Daniel found her in the garden pulling weeds from the soil. "They're moving," he said quietly. "Arizona. My aunt offered them a place." Natalie didn't look up. "Good," she said simply. "Maybe they'll find peace there." Daniel crouched beside her, his tone hesitant. "Do you ever think we went too far?" She brushed dirt from her hands. "No. We went far enough." She met his eyes, steady and kind. "What we did wasn't revenge, Daniel. It was protection. For our kids. For us." He nodded slowly, the understanding finally complete. "I used to think keeping the peace was noble," he admitted. "But peace without truth isn't peace, it's surrender." Natalie smiled softly. "Exactly. You can't build a family on fear and call it love." That evening, the four of them had dinner together under the patio lights. No yelling, no corrections, no condescension. Just warmth. Emma talked about her upcoming recital, Liam about his baseball team. When Daniel reached for Natalie's hand across the table, it wasn't out of apology, it was gratitude. They had walked through fire and come out as something stronger. A few days later, Natalie received a letter postmarked from Arizona. The handwriting was unmistakable, Eleanor's still elegant but shaky. "Natalie," it began. "I've had a lot of time to think. You were right about many things, though. I'll never say you were kind about how you proved them. Howard's health is failing and I'm tired. Maybe you'll never forgive us, but I hope your children will grow up better than we did. That will be your true victory." There was no apology, not really, but there was truth. And that, Natalie thought, was more than she'd ever expected. She folded the letter and tucked it in a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a record. Some chapters needed to remain closed, not erased. Weeks passed. The seasons shifted. The kids' laughter returned to the house like music. On quiet nights, Natalie would stand by their doors watching them sleep peacefully in the rooms that had once been stolen from them. Justice wasn't just about reclaiming walls or property, it was about giving her children back the sense of safety her in-laws had tried to take. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel came up behind her on the porch, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "You did it," he murmured. "You ended the cycle." She leaned back against him, eyes on the horizon. "We did it," she corrected. And maybe that's what legacy should really mean. Not what you pass down in wealth, but what you stop passing down in pain. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely at peace. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just whole. 3 months later, a letter from Charles Montgomery arrived at the house. The envelope bore Summit Realty Group's new embossed seal, a sunrise crest symbolizing new beginnings. Inside was a formal note. Under new leadership, the company has posted its best quarter in 5 years. The board has voted to make your position as majority shareholder permanent. We've also renamed our community scholarship after you, the Natalie Pierce Integrity Fund. She read it twice slowly, then placed it on the kitchen counter where sunlight pooled through the window. Daniel came up behind her, reading over her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "You turned something toxic into something good." She smiled faintly. That was always the goal. Justice means nothing if it doesn't lead to healing. The phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but you're teaching your children to be ruthless. One day they'll do to you what you did to us." It was Eleanor. Natalie stared at the words for a long time, then hit delete. She didn't need to answer. The message said more about Eleanor than it ever could about her. Some people only understood love when it came wrapped in control. She wasn't one of them anymore. That evening, she took the drive through downtown, passing the Summit Realty offices. The new sign gleamed under soft exterior lights, modern, simple, unburdened by old names. Employees were leaving for the night, laughing as they locked up carrying files and coffees instead of fear and exhaustion. That was the difference. Integrity made people stood taller. At home, she parked in the driveway and stepped out just as the porch light flicked on. Emma ran out to meet her barefoot, holding a drawing. "Look, Mom," she said proudly. It was a picture of their family, 4 figures holding hands under a banner that said home. Natalie crouched, studying the tiny details: Daniel's paint-splattered shirt, Liam's baseball glove, Emma's piano, and in the corner her standing tall, smiling. For the first time she was in the center, not pushed to the side. "It's beautiful," Natalie whispered, and meant it. That night, after the kids went to bed, she and Daniel sat by the fireplace with mugs of tea. "You ever think about them?" he asked quietly. Sometimes, she admitted, but not with anger anymore, just clarity. She stared into the flames, her reflection flickering. "I spent years trying to earn their approval. Now I just hope our kids never waste that kind of energy on people who don't deserve it." Daniel nodded. "You know, he said I used to think strength meant silence, letting them have their way because they were family. But you showed me it's the opposite. Strength is protecting peace, not pretending it exists." Natalie smiled, her voice low. "Peace is earned the same way respect is, by refusing to be small for anyone." Days turned into weeks. The Pierce name faded from the headlines, replaced by new stories and newer scandals. But the lesson lingered quietly in Natalie's home. Emma practiced piano every morning, Liam built model airplanes in his restored room, and Daniel began sketching plans to start his own small architecture firm, a dream he'd shelved for years to appease his parents. "You should," Natalie had told him. "Build something that's yours." And he did. One evening, as she walked through the house locking up, Natalie paused by her study, the same room where she'd once typed her first email to the board. Now sunlight fell across the desk, illuminating the framed certificate from Summit Realty for restoring integrity through leadership. She didn't hang it out of pride. She hung it as a reminder that even in a world built on hierarchy and entitlement, truth could still win quietly without shouting. She sat down, opened her laptop, and began drafting a letter not to Eleanor or Howard, but to her children. She titled it, "What Real Family Means." Her fingers moved slowly over the keys. Family, she wrote, isn't about obligation. It's about safety. If someone makes you feel small, that's not love. If they make you doubt your worth, that's not guidance. The world will tell you that power means control, but real power is the ability to walk away from what breaks you and build something better. Never mistake silence for peace or cruelty for strength. Stand up for what matters even when it costs you comfort, especially then. She stopped reading the words over, then hit save. One day when Emma and Liam were older, they'd understand that the real inheritance she'd left them wasn't money or property, it was this. The knowledge that boundaries were sacred, that respect was non-negotiable, and that justice didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it just wore quiet resolve. Natalie closed the laptop and stood, feeling the stillness of the house wrap around her like a promise. Upstairs, she heard Emma humming a lullaby and Liam whispering to their cat. Ordinary sounds, peaceful ones. Before turning off the lights, she looked out the window at the garden blooming again, untended for months, but stubborn in its return. Growth after damage, beauty after harm. That was the rhythm of survival. She smiled, whispered softly into the silence. They called it revenge, but it was never that. It was restoration. Then she turned off the lamp and walked upstairs to kiss her children goodnight, each one safe in their own room, surrounded by the quiet proof that justice, when done right, doesn't destroy. It heals.